Reading Ambedkar. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Writings and Speeches. Volume 3 Philosophy of Hinduism, India and the Prerequisites of Communism, Chapter 1 to 14. Revolution and Center Revolution, Buddha and Karl Marx. So, this is volume 3 we are studying. Now, let me come to the chapter. So, today we will read chapter 1. Yes, so this is the content of the chapter. Volume 3, chapter 1 is Philosophy of Hinduism, and the rest of the chapters we will be studying later on. Chapter 2, Hindu Social Order, its Essential Principles. Chapter 3, the Hindu Social Order, its Unique Features. And Chapter 4, Symbols of Hinduism. So we'll try to cover this, and I'll try to post this whole reading within 2 videos, because these are long readings. Chapter 1 itself is of more than 90 pages. Then it is again almost 100 pages. So total 130 pages are there. So even if I say it's 100 page per chapter, means almost 300 pages are there. So we'll do it in 3 stages maybe. Let's start beginning. Now part 1, Philosophy of Hinduism. And I'm starting here. Beginning. Chapter 1, Philosophy of Hinduism. What is the philosophy of Hinduism? This is a question which arises in its logical sequence. But apart from its logical sequence, its importance is such that it can never be omitted from consideration. Without it, no one can understand the aim and ideals of Hinduism. It is obvious that such a study must be proceeded by a certain amount of what may be called clearing of ground and defining the terms involved. At the outset, it may be asked, what does this proposed title comprehend? Is this title of Philosophy of Hinduism of the same nature as that of the Philosophy of Religion? I wish I could commit myself one way or the other on this point. Indeed, I cannot. I have read a good deal on the subject. But I confess I have not got a clear idea of what is meant by philosophy of religion. This is probably due to 2 facts. In the first place, while religion is something definite, there is nothing definite as to what is to be included in the term philosophy. In this second place, philosophy and religion have been adversaries, if not actual antagonists, as may be seen from the story of philosophers and theologians. According to the story, the two were engaged in disputation, and the theologians accused the philosopher that he was like a blind man in a dark room looking for black cat which was not there. In reply, the philosophers charged the theologian, saying that he was like a blind man in the dark room looking for a black cat which was not there, but he declared to have found there. Perhaps it is the unhappy choice of the title, Philosophy of Religion, which is responsible for causing confusion in the matter of the exact definition of its field. The nearest approach to an intelligible statement as to the exact subject matter of philosophy of religion I find in Professor Pringle Pattison, who observes, and I quote, a few words may be useful at the outset as an indication of what was commonly meant by philosophy of religion. Philosophy was declared long ago by Plato as the synoptic view of things. That is to say, it is the attempt to see things together, to keep all the main features of the world in view, and to grasp them in their relation to another as a part of one whole. Only thus can we acquire a sense of proportion and estimate aright the significance of any particular range of facts of our ultimate conclusion about the nature of the world process and the world ground. Accordingly, the philosophy of any particular department of experience, the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of art, the philosophy of law, is to be taken as meaning as an analysis and interpretation of the experience in question in its bearing upon our view of man and world in which he lives, and when the fact upon which we concentrate are so universal and in their nature so remarkable as though disclosed by the history of religion, the philosophy of men's religious experience cannot but exercise a determining influence upon our general philosophical conclusion. In fact, with many writers, the particular discussion tend to merge in the moral general. The facts which a philosophy of religion has to deal are, as supplies by the history of religion, in the most comprehensive sense of that term. The Thales puts all religions of the civilized and uncivilized world, dead and living, is a historical and psychological phenomenon in all its manifestations. These facts, it should be noted, constitute the data of philosophy of religion. They do not themselves constitute a philosophy, or in Thales use the term science of religion. If he says, I have minutely described all the religion in existence, the doctrine, myth, and customs, the observance they inculcate, and the organizations of their adherents, tracing the different religion from their origin to their bloom and decay. I have merely collected the materials with which the science of religion worked. The historical record have complete is not enough. Pure history is not philosophy. To achieve a philosophy of religion, we should be able to discover in the varied manifestations a common principle to whose root in human nature we can point, whose evolution we can trace by it legible stages from lower to higher, more adequate forms, as well as its intimate relation and other main factors in human civilization. If this is philosophy of religion, it appears to me that it is merely a different name for that department of study which is called comparative religion, with aided aim of discovering a common principle in varied manifestations of religion. Whatever be the scope and value of such a study, I am using the title Philosophy of Religion to donate something quite different from the sense and aim given to it by Professor Pringle Pattison. I am using the word philosophy in its original sense, which was twofold. It meant teachings, as it did when people spoke of the philosophy of Socrates or philosophy of Plato. In another sense, it meant critical reason used by passing judgments upon things and events. Our proceedings on this basis of philosophy of religion is to me not merely a descriptive science. I regard it as being both descriptive as well as normative. Insofar as it deals with the teachings of a religion, philosophy of religion become a descriptive science insofar as it involves the use of critical reason for passing judgment on those teachings. The philosophy of religion become a normative science. From this, it will be clear that I shall be concerned with in the study of the philosophy of Hinduism. To be explicit, I shall be putting Hinduism on its trial to assert its worth as a way of life. A way of life. Here is one part of the ground cleared. There remain another part to be cleared. That concerns the ascertainment of a factor's concern and the definitions of the term I shall be using. A study of philosophy of religion in its seems to me involve are like the unknown quantities, constraint and factors in a product. One must ascertain and define these dimensions of the philosophy of religion if an examination of it is to be fruitful. Of the three dimensions, religion is the first. One must therefore define what he understands by religion in order to avoid argument being directed at cross purpose. This is particularly necessary in the case of religion for the reason that there is no agreement as to its exact definition. This is no place to enter upon the elaborate consideration of this question. I will therefore content myself by stating the meaning in which I am using the word in discussion, which follows. I am using the word religion to mean theology. This will perhaps be insufficient for the purpose of definition, for there are different kind of theologies and must particularize which one I mean. Historically, there have been two theological spokens for of from ancient times: mythical theology and civil theology. The Greeks who distinguished them gave a definite content. By mythical theology, they mean the tales of goods and their doing told in or implied by current imaginative literature. Civil theology, according to them, consisted of knowledge of the various feasts and feature facts of the state, effect of the state calendar, and ritual appropriate to them. I am not using the word theology in either of these two senses of that word. I mean that theology, natural theology, which is doctrine of God and divine, as an integral part of the theory of nature. As traditionally understood, there are three theses which natural theology propounds. One is that God exists as its author of what we call nature or universe. Two, that God controls all the events which makes nature, and God exercises a government over mankind in accordance with its sovereign moral law. I am aware there is another class of theology known as revealed theology, spontaneous self-disclosure of divine reality, which may be distinguished from natural theology. But this distinction does not really matter, for as has been pointed out, that a revelation may be either leave the results won by natural theology standing without modifications, merely supplementing them by further knowledge not attainable by unassisted human efforts. It may be transformed natural theology in such a way that all the truths of natural theology would acquire richer and deeper meaning when seen in the light of true revelation. But the view that a genuine natural theology and genuine revelation theology might stand in a real contradiction may be safely excluded as not being possible. Taking the three theses of theology, namely the existence of God, second, the God's providential government of the universe, and third, God's moral government of mankind. I take religion to mean the propounding of an ideal scheme of divine governance, the aim and object of which is to make the social order in which men live a moral order. This is what I understand by religion, and this is the sense in which I shall be using the term religion in this discussion. The second dimension is to know the ideal scheme for which a religion stands. To define what is fixed, permanent and dominant part in religion of any society, to separate its essential characteristics for those which are unessential, is often very difficult. The reason for this difficulty in the probability lies in the difficulty pointed out by Professor Robertson Smith when he says, and I quote, the traditional uses of religion had grown up gradually in the course of many centuries and reflected habits of thought, characteristics of very diverse stage of men's intellectual and moral development. No conception of the nature of the God could possibly afford the clue to all part of that motley complex of rites and ceremonies which the later paganism had received by inheritance from a series of ancestors in every state of culture from pure savagery upward. The record of the religious thought of mankind as it is embodied in religious institutions resemble the geological record of the history of Earth's crust. The new and the old are preserved side by side, or rather layer upon layer. The same thing has happened in India. Speaking about the growth of religion in India, said Professor Max Muller, and I quote, we have seen a religion growing up from stage to stage, from the simplest childish prayer to the highest metaphysical abstractions. In the majority of the hymn of the Veda, we might recognize the childhood. In the Brahmins and their sacrificial, domestic and moral ordinances, the busy manhood, the Upanishada, the old age of Vedic religion, we could have well understood if, with the historical progress of the Indian mind, they had discarded the pure childish prayers as soon as they have had arrived at the maturity of the Brahmins. And if, when the vanity of sacrifices and the real character of the old gods had once been recognized, they would have been superseded by the more exalted religion of the Upanishada. But it was not so. Every religious thought that had once found expression in India, that had once been handed down as a sacred heirloom, was preserved. And the thoughts of the three historical periods, the childhood, the manhood, and the old age of Indian nation, were meant to do permanent service in three stages of the life for every individual. Thus, alone, we can explain how the same sacred code, the Veda, contains not only the record of different phrases of religious thought, but of doctrine which we may call almost diametrically opposite to each other. But this difficulty is not so great in case of religions which are positive religions. The fundamental characteristics of positive religion is that they have not grown up like primitive religions, under the action of the unconscious forces operating silently from the age to age, but trace their origin to the teaching of great religious innovators, who spoke as organs of the divine revelation, being the result of conscious formulations. The philosophy of religion, which is positive, is easy to find a way to state. Hinduism, like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is in the main positive religion. One does not have to search for its scheme for divine governance. It is like an unwritten constitution. On the Hindu scheme of divine governance is enshrined in a written constitution, and anyone who cares to know it will find it laid bare that sacred book called Manusmriti, a divine code which lays down the rule which govern the religion, ritualistic, and social life of the Hindus in minute detail, which must be regarded as the Bible of Hindus and contain the philosophy of Hinduism. The third dimension in the philosophy of religion is the criteria to be adopted for judging the value of the ideal scheme of divine governance for which a given religion stands. Religion must be put on its trial. By what criteria shall it be judged? That lead to the definition of the norm. Of the three dimensions, this third one is the most difficult, that to be ascertained and defined. Unfortunately, the question does not appear to have been tackled, although much has been written on the philosophy of religion, and certainly no method has been found for satisfactorily dealing with the problem. One is left to one's own method for determining the issues. As far as myself, I think it is safe to proceed on the view that to know the philosophy of any movement or any institution, one must study the revolution which the movement or the institution has undergone. Revolution is the mother of philosophy, and if it is not the mother of philosophy, it is a lamp which illuminates philosophy. Religion is no exception to this rule. To me, therefore, it seems quite evident that the best method to ascertain the criteria by which to judge the philosophy of religion is to study revolution which religion has undergone. That is the method which I propose to adopt. Students of history are familiar with one religious revolution. That revolution was concerned with the sphere of religion and extent of its authority. There was a time when religion had covered the whole field of human knowledge and claimed infallibility for what is taught. It covered astronomy and taught a theory of universe according to which the earth is at rest in the center of universe, while the sun, moon, planet, and system of the fixed stars revolve around its own sphere. It included biology and geology and pronounced the view that the growth of life on the earth has been created at all once and had contained from the time of creation onward all the heavenly bodies that is now contains and all kind of animals of plants. It claimed medicine to be its providence and taught that disease was neither either a divine visitation and punishment for sin, or it was the work of demon, that it could be cured by the intervention of saints, either in the person or thought through their holy relics or by prayers. And the quote which was there earlier, I am reading it out. Some students of philosophy of religion seems to regard the study of first two dimensions as all that the field of philosophy of religion need include. They do not seem to recognize that the consideration of the third dimension is necessary part of the study of philosophy of religion. As an illustration of this, see the article The Theology by Mr. D.S. Adams in Hastings Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, volume 12, page 393. I dissent from this view. The difference is probably due to the fact that I regard philosophy of religion as normative study and as a descriptive study. I do not think that there can be such a thing as a general philosophy of religion. I believe each religion has its particular philosophy. To me, there is no philosophy of religion. There is a philosophy of religion, a pilgrimage, and which, when due to demons, by exorcism and by treatment which the demons and the patient found disgusting. It is also claimed physiology and psychology to be its domain and taught that the body and souls were two distinct substances.